210 billion euros in frozen assets, 5 million investors locked out of their own money, and one Dutch chipmaker that just split into two countries. Western governments seized control using national security laws, but the real story is what happened 72 hours later when China's response triggered the first corporate secession in modern history. This latest period has been extraordinary for everyone watching the geopolitical and economic shifting dynamics of global power and trade. We are sure you already heard most of the stories I'm going to talk about in this episode, but stick with me till the end. There are some interesting developments, and I really want to know your thoughts on them. We are witnessing fundamental questions emerge about the rules of the international system. When can individual nations or regional blocs unilaterally freeze sovereign assets without United Nations Security Council authorization? Who decides when national security justifies seizing private property or blocking access to financial systems? These questions go far beyond legal technicalities. They determine whether smaller nations can pursue independent economic policies or whether they risk having their wealth held hostage. I'm covering four major developments that happened this month. Each one reveals something important about how nations are responding to these pressures. First, China's rare earth export controls and why India got different treatment than the US and European Union. Second, the Nexperia seizure in the Netherlands and China's response. Third, the ongoing freeze of Russian and Venezuelan assets in Western banks. And fourth, a good news, Indonesia's full commitment to the BRICS New Development Bank. Let's break down what's actually happening here. In previous videos, we already explained that China controls roughly 70% of global rare earth mining and 90% of refining capacity. That's massive leverage over supply chains for semiconductors, electric vehicles, aerospace, and defense systems. In April 2025, China announced new export controls on rare earths. Then they expanded those controls in October. The US response was immediate. President Trump threatened an additional 100% tariff on Chinese goods. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called it China versus the world. The European Union was equally alarmed. Some European companies had to halt production. European Union officials held emergency meetings on October 20th with automotive, defense, and wind energy sectors. But here is where it gets interesting. While tightening exports to the West, China lifted restrictions on rare earth magnets to India on August 20th. This came after negotiations between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. India's auto sector needs about 870 tons of rare earth magnets annually. The previous restrictions threatened to delay electric vehicle launches. The lifting of curbs brought immediate relief to Indian manufacturers. So, why the different treatment? It's pretty obvious that China is focusing on its supply chain relationships with key partners, using export controls as a bargaining chip against countries it sees as rivals. The US noted that while its trade with China fell 27%, Chinese exports to ASEAN nations rose 16% and to Africa by 56% in September 2025. Did you hear about it in some mainstream media? What do you think? Is this pure economics or a geopolitical strategy? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now let's talk about the Nexperia case. This situation is remarkably complex. Well, Nexperia is a Dutch chipmaker acquired by China's WingTech technology in 2019. For years, operations went normally. Then, in late September 2025, Dutch authorities took an extraordinarily illegal step. They seized control of management and removed the Chinese CEO Zhang Xuezhang. But why? The Dutch government did it. They believed Wingtech planned to move Nexperia's European manufacturing and intellectual property to China. Minister of Economic Affairs Vincent Carremans cited risks of knowledge leakage and loss of production capacity crucial for European industries. Court documents suggest, wait for it, the United States pressured the Netherlands to act. What a surprise, right? Well, Nexperia might have ended up on the US entity list if the Chinese leadership hadn't changed. But China's response was swift. On October the 4th, China's Ministry of Commerce imposed export controls on Nexperia's Chinese subsidiary. Then things got unusual. Over the weekend of October 18-19, Nexperia China issued a letter to employees. Staff at facilities in Dongguan, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and Wuxi were told to ignore instructions from Dutch headquarters. The Chinese unit declared itself independent and said local management would take over operations. This raises serious questions about corporate sovereignty and government intervention in business. Let me know what you think. Is the Dutch action legitimate national security protection? Or is it, as China claims, discriminatory targeting of Chinese investment? It seems that it is not business as usual anymore. The frozen assets story is another example of the same thing. But before we go any further, I need your support. We are a group of freelancers who aren't backed by the government or any oligarchs. So please support us with a donation. Even just a like, share, or subscription would be great. Well, the frozen asset. This is perhaps the most contentious issue in modern financial geopolitics. Following the 2022 escalation of conflict, the European Union froze approximately 210 billion euros in Russian assets. About 185 billion euros are held in the Belgian depository Euroclear. But here is what often gets overlooked. Between 3.5 and 5 million ordinary Russian private investors also had their assets frozen. These are people not personally under sanctions. The total frozen private assets are estimated at roughly 12 billion euros. That's about 2,400 euros per investor, just over two average Russian monthly salaries. Getting these assets unfrozen requires expensive lawyers. One investor reportedly spent 60,000 euros to unblock assets, far exceeding what was frozen. Many of these frozen assets are American securities like shares in Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, and other major companies. To unblock US stocks, investors need a license from the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control. So far, no licenses have been issued to Russian investors. Venezuela faces a similar situation. About $1.8 billion in Venezuelan gold reserves remain blocked at the Bank of England. This stems from the UK's 2019 decision to recognize Juan Guaido as interim president instead of Nicolas Maduro. Even after Venezuela's opposition parties removed Guaido in December 2022, the gold remains frozen. These actions raise fundamental questions about the global financial system. When can governments legally freeze private assets? What protection exists for ordinary citizens caught in geopolitical disputes? These aren't simple questions with easy answers. What's your take on that? Here is the good news, but heads up, there could be some catches. You know, Indonesia formally joined BRICS in January 2025 under President Prabowo Subianto. On October 9th, Chief Economic Minister Erlangga Hartarto confirmed government approval to purchase shares in the BRICS New Development Bank. It has an authorized capital of 100 billion US dollars. So far, $39 billion have been approved for 120 projects, mainly in transport, sanitation, and renewable energy. Indonesia views NDB membership as a boost for its 77 national strategic projects, but joining raises an important question. Will Indonesia face secondary sanctions from Western nations for deepening BRICS ties? Russia's ambassador to Indonesia addressed this directly in a recent interview. He stated that, quote, Indonesia will not stand alone and that BRICS countries will support you, end of a quote. Russia and Indonesia already have long-standing military and technical cooperation dating back to Indonesia's independence in the 1950s and 60s. They held a bilateral naval exercise called Oruda in the Java Sea last year. A second exercise, Oruda 2, is planned for waters near Russia. Indonesia is clearly diversifying its economic partnerships. Whether this provides real protection from Western economic pressure remains to be seen. These four stories illustrate a fundamental shift in global economic relationships. Nations are building alternative financial institutions, securing critical supply chains outside traditional Western channels, and testing the limits of economic sovereignty. The BRICS expansion represents one response to concerns about the concentration of economic power. The Western use of sanctions and asset freezes represents another set of tools in geopolitical competition. Neither approach is without consequences. Export controls disrupt global supply chains. Asset seizures undermine trust in financial institutions, and military economic blocs risk creating new divisions. The real question isn't who's right or wrong in absolute terms. It's how these competing systems will coexist, what rules will govern international commerce, and whether cooperation is possible in an increasingly multipolar world. What's your take on these developments? Do you see them as necessary rebalancing or dangerous fragmentation? The comments are open for discussion. Thanks for watching.